On is muted. So are we good to go here? All right, we'll call the meeting to order. Welcome, everybody. Where's my agenda here? Hang on a minute. There we go. We have a pretty focused agenda today. So does anybody have pecuniary interest to disclose under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Nobody is volunteering for that. All right, we'll say none shown. Did we see the minutes from the last meeting? I think they were attached to Devlin's handout.
I'll move they've been accepted.
All right, second for that?
I'll second.
Okay, Kathy, all in favor? We're good. All right. So the agenda today, again, very focused. Hope everybody had a chance to look at it. And I want to thank Mayor Linton for providing us with that document. And it flows from the discussion we had at the last meeting, as I think what we really want the committee to focus on for the next couple of years of its mandate. We've an element of healthy growth that kind of touches on a lot of things, but it is still one thing, and that's attainable housing. And the action items ultimately that we would want the township to take, or county perhaps, but mostly the township, to further that objective within our community. And so that, I think, will be the focus of our discussion today. We have a document in front of us from the county. I think I'll ask Mayor Linton to take us through that. And the idea at the end of the day, I believe, is to come up with 2 or 3 of those action items that are at the bottom of that document that we would be in a position as a committee to recommend to council that they take the actions that are required. So whether it's something to do with development charges, something to do with zoning, something to do with the development approval process, whatever it is we come up with, that would be the focus. And the goal, of course, would be to remove barriers to the provision of attainable housing, incentivize perhaps the private sector to start to provide more supply, and to do what we can do as a municipality to bring more of that on stream, and to, shall we say, get our vacancy rate up to where it is, so that people who work can afford to live here. And I think that's basically the goal. So that said, maybe I'll ask Mayor Linton to just take us through that document, and then hopefully we'll have the same kind of discussion we had last meeting, perhaps maybe a little bit more focused on the items that show up at the end of it. Mayor Linton.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. So what I've done here is I've just pulled together a document, taking a look at some of the material that the county has put together and some of the projects that they've done, because what's really important is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel here. We want to work, we want to go to the next level, but kind of lean on some of the work that's already been done. So instead of just sending several links to the committee, I thought I'd go through it first and pull out the things that I thought were interesting and would provide some good context. So I didn't try to be comprehensive here. I didn't try to include everything, but I just wanted to make sure that we kind of began our discussions and drove towards some positive action from a place of understanding what the county does and where we can potentially fit in. So I'll just walk through it, and at the end of it, there's been several suggestions that came out of the county's attainable housing strategy document that they just completed. And so I've just taken those verbatim. And I know that I had a conversation with Brett and with Dawn earlier, and we might have to change the wording. We might have to change that. And that's completely within the scope of this committee to change the wording of it. But I didn't want to change the wording at this point, because this is what the suggestions or recommendations that came from that project were. So when we get to those, I know that Brett will have some things to talk about. But at the end of the day, what would be really positive for me is if we could, like Dawn said, if we could identify 2 to 3 key actions that we want to get some traction on and see some real action towards, I think that'd be important, because everybody knows that this is an issue. Increasing awareness that housing is an issue is not that valuable right now. We all know it. The province knows it. All the municipalities know it. What's important is that we recognize that it's a complex situation, but there's real actions that we can take to make things better. And so if we can do anything as a committee to start to push the agenda on that front, then we're being successful. So I'm really, really happy that the committee has chosen to take this on as a focus area, because I think it's one of the biggest areas of risk that we have right now when it comes to healthy growth. So I'm glad that we saw that last meeting, and I was really pleased by the nature of the discussion that we had last week. We had some really good people around the table here, and I want to make sure that we leverage all of your massive brains to come up with things that actually work. So I'll get into that. So the first thing I wanted to do is establish a purpose behind this. So the purpose of this document, pulling together this summary, is to provide some background information to the committee, just to help inform our discussions and to contribute to an action-oriented approach to Center Wellington's current housing affordability issue. So I did find a definition of affordable housing in one of the documents that was from one of the open houses that the county held. And according to the Ontario Provincial Policy Statement, affordable rental housing is defined as the least expensive of these two things. One, a unit for which rent does not exceed 30% of gross annual income for low and moderate income households, or the unit for which rent is at or below average market rent of a unit in a regional market area. So the lowest of those two things, that's what affordable housing is. So we know that Wellington County is the level of government that has the jurisdiction for affordable housing. So I want to go through.
Yeah, it might be. Would it be possible to just put the document up and share the document again? Is that helpful or no?
It's not helpful for me. If it's helpful for the committee, yeah, let's do it.
Can
I
we do
like
that?
being basic, but if it's helpful for the committee, if he wants to do it that way, that's fine.
Mr. Chairman, it's up to you. It might be helpful, but you make the call.
Well, you need to be looking at it, I think, to follow along. I'm looking at it on my phone as we go here. If it's possible,
I have it printed off.
if it's possible for Devlin to put it up because someone doesn't have it to hand, that's great. Oh, what happened there? But we do
Either way is okay, Mr. Chair. I just thought it might be helpful.
Yeah, no,
I have it.
there we go.
I have it printed as well.
I've lost now. Well, I guess we still have our pictures. Okay, there we go.
Okay. So Wellington County is the kind of the consolidated municipal service manager for all of the city of Guelph and all of Wellington County. A lot of people don't know that Wellington County looks after affordable housing for the city of Guelph as well, but they do. And so Wellington County has the leadership role when it comes to system planning, the coordination of services, development of partnerships in the areas of housing and homelessness. So that is where the county plays. Strong partnerships exist between the province, the county, the 7-member municipalities, the city of Guelph, and other community stakeholders right now, and that's completely essential. I see this as in my role as warden because I see the nature of the conversation that has to happen between the county of Wellington and the city of Guelph. And as you can expect, housing and homelessness in an urban setting is very different than a rural setting. And we always have to bring the county perspective to that because there's a lot of couch surfing that goes on when it comes to homelessness in the county. It's not as visible as it is in the city. And I think the same thing happens when we're talking about affordable housing. A lot of people are in basements in the county, and some of it's hidden. So you have to look at it differently in the county, and we see that all the time. So there's a number of goals and actions that demonstrates the complexity of this. So there's a recognition from the county that a multi-pronged solution is. So I included that graphic there just for the committee to understand all the different players when it comes to homelessness and housing. So you have the local municipalities, that's us, we play a role. The county social services, we look after all the social services, which a lot of there's the same customers, whether if it's a homelessness situation or a social services situation, often there's a lot of overlap in what people are helped by those. Provincial government plays a huge role, they're the regulator. Federal government and CMHA, they're also a regulator and they provide some funding. And of course, then there's the housing sector, property management, landlords, and that whole group, that private sector side. Community benefit sector, there's a lot of not-for-profits and a lot of church groups, a lot of service clubs that are involved at the same time, community members. So there's a whole list, and what we want to do in this committee is, okay, so where do we fit? What can we do? Recognizing that this is a bit of an area where a lot of people play, we want to make sure that we're suggesting or we're talking about things that we actually can do something about. It doesn't help us to have a lot of conceptual discussions about things. We want to get down to what action can we take. So a few key facts that I pulled out that I thought would be interesting for the committee to see. On average, 108 individuals access emergency shelters in Guelph per night. So that's 2012 numbers. I think that's closer to about 130 right now. 1,300 households are on the centralized waiting list for social housing in Guelph, Wellington. That's a little higher now. That's a lot of people. So this is on the far end there. In Center Wellington, we have two affordable housing projects, Ferguson Place and Gordon and Webster Place on Gordon Street. A few things about that. Funding of the project, some funding came from the province, some from the federal government. So because of that, people can apply from anywhere across Canada to live in those two apartment buildings. And there's nothing that we can do. Typically, there's about 10 move-outs every year in those two units. So the wait time could be anywhere between 2 and 6 years to get into that. Depends what kind of unit you want. And the wait times are done in chronological order. And just a point, Webster Place, the one building there is a 55+ building. So that's a seniors focused. So a couple of the, just for information, Ferguson and Webster Place, a few facts there. There's a number of 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, barrier free. And then you see the wait list there. So then one of the questions that was asked a couple meetings ago was the rent. So this is all rent geared to income here. And so the 1 bedroom in Ferguson Place is at $764. So it's capped at that. And that's a regulated figure. County doesn't come up with that. We're told what it has to be. And then Webster Place, 1 bedroom is $815. So that's the senior. So I think those are the rents. So it gives us a little bit of information on what the rents is for affordable housing in Center Wellington. I want to mention, I didn't put this in here because it hasn't passed our budget yet, but the 10-year capital forecast for the county is looking at building affordable housing units every, I think it's every 2 or 3 years, which is really, really good because we have to start putting money in our 10-year forecast to be very proactive in building affordable housing. So that's going to be coming to county council to establish a new systematic program for building affordable housing across the county. So it's good for us to know that. And when I get more information on that, I'll make sure I share it with the group. So then we're shifting gears from affordable housing to attainable housing. So attainable housing is a little less defined because the idea behind attainable housing is just that people can, housing can be different types of housing can be attainable at different income levels. So it's not a formula, it's not a number, but it's more of a term that's used, and that's the term that we can use as a township since we don't play in the affordable housing sector. So how can we make it so that the majority of people at different income levels can afford to live in Center Wellington where they choose to live? So The Wellington County actually did an attainable housing strategy just a year ago, and it was driven out of economic development, which is a little bit odd when you think about it at first. But the need for it came out of a lot of discussions that we had with businesses across the county who were having a hard time getting workers because they couldn't afford to live here. So that was kind of the driver behind doing it, and doing it out of economic development. So we did some really good work. We brought in a pretty established consultant to do this work with us. And they did a significant amount of contextual work before they came out with a series of recommendations. So I wanted to bring up some of that stuff that was kind of in information. And there's this whole, you can have this whole study and all the recommendations as well. But here's I just pulled out some of the key items here. So the average cost of housing across Wellington is $453,000. Huge disparity between Minto in the north, Wellington North, and Mapleton, and then Puslynch in the south. Huge disparity. There's very little in common when you talk about what housing looks like in Minto versus what housing looks like in Puslynch. And that's what makes the county so difficult on a number of fronts, is there is very little similarities between some of our different communities. Center Wellington is kind of right in the middle. So it kind of works for us because we're typically, when you see some of the numbers, we're kind of the average of everything. So the county numbers and the Center Wellington numbers are usually in the same ballpark in a number of different indicators. So families across Wellington, these families have to earn about $111,000 to purchase a home without risk of defaulting on a mortgage loan. So that's good to note. So then driving down into Center Wellington, median house price in Elora is $725,000. Household must earn at least $140,000 to afford a home in Elora. So that's pretty high, and that's significantly increased in the last few years. Fergus is substantially different. Median house price is $480,000, and a household must earn at least $94,000. And I think that's based on 30% rule. Rental vacancy rate is 1%. And so, a best practice that we heard from our consulting partner was a 3% vacancy rate is necessary for a healthy market. So we're quite a ways underneath that. Annual housing forecast for the county to 2040 anticipates, if we go along the way we're going right now, it anticipates 75% of new housing is low-rise housing form. And that's from a study done by Watson in 2016. So the issue with low-rise housing is that's what's not attainable for a moderate income household. So that's the crux of the issue that we have. We identified, based on interviews that we had with a number of developers, and this is, I didn't know if Steve was going to be on the call because he might dispute some of the stuff as one developer, but this is the feedback that came back from all the developers that were interviewed as part of this project. So majority of builders are risk averse. Why change course when demand exists? And Steve talked about this last meeting, is there's a market for single family houses, and they're still selling like hotcakes for people who want to have a single family house. And for builders, that's easy. That's easy to do. Builders want to control the building process, creating housing, topography, 100 to 500K homes, limited use of available land. If you change from single families, that means a longer approval process and confrontation with the community. We saw that in the public meeting that we held just last week. Servicing costs stifle housing supply too. And CW, anything above 6 units is a different taxation. This is interview. I don't even know if that part is true, but this is what came back from the developers. Rental market experiencing similar challenges with respect to attainability. So across the county, it's a 1% vacancy rate right now, and that's difficult. So the purpose of that project that I'm talking about was to drive towards change. So the report came up with 2 types of different recommendations or suggestions for going ahead. And these are what I said were verbatim out of the report. So one of the things that they talked about, one of the themes that they talked about was policy recommendations. And the second theme is related to financial incentive recommendations. So I've just listed them here. And I'm just going to quickly go through them, but this is where this is where I'd suggest that we spend some time to identify what we want to do as a committee. So some of the policy recommendations that came out: establishing an attainable housing growth target. What are we driving towards in our community? What would make us a healthy community here so that the majority of people who want to live here can live here? And the consultant felt like if you have that target, you have something to shoot for, and something to communicate out, and both to politically and also to the community. We're moving in these directions because we're trying to hit this attainable housing growth target so that the majority of people who want to live in Center Wellington can afford to live in Center Wellington. So that was something that I wouldn't mind us having a discussion about. Bonusing for higher density developments is another suggestion that came out. Streamlining the planning approval process, the development system, it was identified as one option to move ahead on. Strengthening, updating the official plan policies regarding second units. Amending the official plan, existing CIP planning policies. And these things could also, when it talks about amending policies in the official plan, this could also go further than that and talk about changes to zoning. And that's where the township plays a little bit more. And Brett might want to speak to that when we're done here too, because there might be things that we can do on a zoning side of things that are in addition to official plan changes. Then conducting a review of the zoning bylaws to reduce regulatory barriers, such as minimum lot size requirements, minimum setback requirements, and parking requirements, and a reduction in the amount of land required for construction, because this greatly lowers the cost of land acquisition and housing, lowers the cost of housing construction. Use of a secondary plan to address some local issues. So those are the things that came up on a policy side of things. On the financial incentive side of things, a development charge reduction or exemption if you build a certain way, a reduction in parkland dedication requirements, and a planning application or building permit fee reductions or exemptions. So those are some of the incentives that we could potentially talk about to encourage builders to build a certain way. And I just to end, I thought this was an interesting graph. Public perceptions. So this was based on some feedback that was done as part of this project. And the question that was asked was, do you think it's the role of the local governments to encourage more attainable housing? And so you see, they broke the county into the three areas that have the most similar. Like always, Center Wellington is on its own because we're so unique. And a huge percentage of survey respondents thought that it was the role of local government to encourage more attainable housing. So that's good to see. North Wellington, I mean, the numbers coming back are much less, but the percentage is still there. So people recognize that it's a role of local government to encourage attainable housing. So that's all I have. Hopefully that helps, gives a little bit of context to our discussion. And I'll turn it back to the chair for how he wants to go forward. But we didn't want to go too much further at this point until we get some buy-in from the committee as to what those action items or what those suggestions or recommendations that we want to dig in a little bit more. But I hopefully this provides a little bit of context and starts to isolate our sphere of influence when it comes to the township, and then in turn when it comes to the Healthy Growth Committee. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Don.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, that's I think that does set the stage for the discussion we're going to have going forward. And I agree. I think ultimately what we want to see out of this is some concentration on those specific action items that show up in this document. Have a discussion on which ones we might pick, how we would work it, what we would need to do, that kind of thing. So that was what I would hope we would start at least today. maybe if, as Kelly suggested, I don't know if Brett, you've got anything to add to what he said or to flesh out that document, please feel free. You are muted right now.
All right, yeah, I can do that. I guess the way the county's document is laid out, it references strategies that the county itself might have done. But if you look at the figure 2, there's local municipalities, planning and development, land use regulation, and funding. So, our sandbox is a little bit different than the county's, and I think the key role for us is looking at our things that we're responsible for, the zoning bylaw, the official plan. We could make some adjustments or recommend adjustments to the county OP, but largely, if we do an amendment, the county has to approve it. The county's doing their comprehensive review anyway. So zoning bylaw, development charges, those things that are in our sphere of influence are the things that I would think that this committee would get the most bang for your buck out of. In terms of what's on the list, the easiest one to tackle is the additional dwelling units. We've already, back last November 2019, we shared our draft bylaw on additional dwelling units with this committee. And at that time, the county hadn't brought forward their own official plan amendment. So we couldn't really move forward until the county brought theirs forward, and they've now done that. So they've been through the public process and they adopted official plan amendment last Thursday, I believe. The mayor can correct me if I'm wrong. It should have been on the county agenda for adoption. And it can't be appealed, which means it should have taken effect right away. So it should be in effect now. And so we could move forward, bring back our zoning amendment. The other thing I'd suggest is some of the other issues that Kelly mentioned, the policies in the county OP and our zoning might be useful if staff brought forward discussion papers where we could highlight some of the specific things that Mariana and I have noticed in our work are things that are creating barriers. Things like building height limitations, the parking requirements are a thing that hinder the supply. So we could bring forward a discussion paper about those. We could bring forward policies that are in our OP and the county OP that inhibit the supply. One of the things that the committee, we could share with the committee is some of the documents we could give a link to. Bill 108 is the province's More Homes, More Choices Act. And it's clearly meant at municipalities should be doing whatever they can to increase the supply of housing. The provincial government has taken, their approach is clearly on the supply and demand side, and that there's demand but not enough supply, and we need to increase the supply. And whether it's affordable, attainable, we can get at the housing issue by building more supply. So there's provisions in Bill 108 about making sure we have adequate service land available, all those other things, streamlining the development process. The additional dwelling units through Bill 108, they're exempt from development charges. So those things are dealt with. And an individual homeowner can be the one that adds that density. So I think in the last meeting, I talked about what planners have started to call gentle density, where you get 2 or 3 units in an existing neighborhood built by a local person. And by building 1 or 2 units, it enables that person to afford their home because they then have an income. It enables people maybe to maintain heritage homes because they have another source of income that helps support both affordable housing and the preservation of heritage, because you've got this additional income coming from the rental unit. And that person may not be driven by the profit motive that a developer might. And so those units are likely to rent at a more affordable cost. They're cheaper to build, and therefore they could rent more affordably. So there's a whole bunch of things that can be gained just from the additional dwelling units.
Okay, thank you. Is that it?
Yeah.
Just to be clear too, conceptually, so we're all aware of what we're doing here. We are talking about attainable housing. We're not talking about what used to be called, I don't know if it still is or not. We're not talking about social housing. We're not talking about the provision of shelter for homeless people. And we're not talking about publicly provided housing for people on social assistance, which is, a good chunk of the document that you saw today. And that's the county as service manager. That is their primary role in that area. We're talking about privately owned, privately constructed housing for people of low and moderate income, but people who do have income and people who are working for that income underneath those levels of income that was identified in the county report as being required to have housing in Center Wellington. So under the $94,000 or under the $140,000 or under whatever it would take to have rental accommodation for people who work. And that's strictly, I think, and I think that's, the committee needs to be sure that's what it wants its focus, because when you look at those action items, essentially that's what they're addressed at. They're removing barriers, incentivizing private sector people to build housing that meets those tests. And if we have to set up those tests, that's fine. And the idea is to have a supply of that housing that people who don't meet those income levels that are now required still are able to find. And I think the first metric is quite simply to up that vacancy rate from 1% to closer to 3%, which is the target that was recommended. So there's a metric right there after a couple of years that would go a long way to showing that we've actually done something. So we just need to be clear philosophically and conceptually. We're looking at housing that's provided by the private sector to people who have income, people who do work, but whose income is not of a sufficient level to get the housing they need right now based on the supply that's available. So I hope everybody agrees with that. If not, that we need to have that discussion, but that's where we're headed. And all of these action items, essentially, when you boil them down, are ways to make it easier. And by easier, I mean possible and more profitable for private sector developers and builders to construct this housing and make it available on the market and expect to get a return on their money. So that's what we as a municipality would be looking at through these recommendations. So that's what this committee is looking at, those measures to do that. So I hope everybody agrees with that, because if we don't, we need to be very clear on what it is we're looking to do here before we start getting into the detail. Anybody have any comments on that? Don?
Yeah, I've got several comments. So I think the municipality needs to figure out how much they want to put towards this. Whether you put the not getting development charges, whether you create a fund that would subsidize, if you will, and this is contrary to what you were just saying, but subsidize their rents. You take a look at what the county's done is they've had a huge capital expenditure building those two buildings, and it's great. I'm not being critical of that at all, but it's money that's got to come from somewhere. And then they're subsidizing the rents for the people that are in there. So if the town went, like, to get stuff quickly, if the town created a help fund or whatever to help people get into rental housing that's out there now. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is if Brett was saying about the second units. So if you had a second unit go in, and if it was going to be a rental, maybe what you do is you drop the DC charges on it, and then you maybe set a guideline for what the charge would be on that property. Because, but it goes back to the assessment of the extra piece. Like, you fix up your basement, your assessment's going to go up. You put another piece on the back, another little building out the back, your assessment's going to go up. Maybe there's some relief there that could be stopped. And maybe people renting in the, a little place on the back of the property, you could have, a 5-year guarantee that they're going to keep it at this particular rent. Anyhow, just some thoughts. The problem is I had quite a talk with Steve Wright, and these guys are in business to make money. It's really simple. And unless we figure out some way to get around that, and the problem is the difference is so large. I don't think you can drop DC charges and all this other stuff enough to get the rents down to that. Anyhow, yep.
Anybody else? Thank you. Mayor Linton.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to take too much time, but I like where you're going, Don. The only thing I think that we might think about doing on affordable housing is this committee to send a resolution to the county when the county is moving ahead with affordable housing capital projects, and say, as a committee, we recognize that this is something that's important to Center Wellington, and the Healthy Growth Committee, we support this. What that would do, it would be in the wording of the recommendation, or the resolution, what it would do, it would state that we understand this is where the county plays. And we understand we're not playing here, but we support it because we know that affordable housing is very critical to Center Wellington as well.
Yeah, sure is.
So I think that would be a really good way to support something the county is doing, and then get on with the actions that we're going to take here to support the township and moving ahead with attainable housing. So that is something that we can do, and it's something that would be very simple, and it can be presented to the county at the budget time when they're moving ahead with capital projects in their 10-year forecast.
So can I recommend that?
Sure. Any more discussion? I think
I
Brian.
make a recommendation that we send that motion to the county.
Just before we finalize on that, Brian, did you want to say something? I see you had your hand up there.
Well, what I really wanted was just a bit of a clarification, I guess we're defining it a little bit more. Attainable housing, I'm assuming, is both rental and purchasable property. And the difficulty we're facing is that in all instances, it's not necessarily a profitable venture for developers. So another part of it is looking at for whom would it be profitable to create cheaper more rental properties and low cost housing. There's two real elements there that we're talking about. One is creating rental space, which is perhaps in some ways the easier thing to do. Low cost housing, which is not affordable housing, but attainable housing, is probably not as attractive a venture. So they're almost like two different paths here, both of which are good and should be part of the exercise. That's what I was going to say.
Thank you. Councillor Foster, do you have your hand up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There, can you hear me okay? There we go.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was a salesperson on the road for a number of years, covering Ontario and Quebec. And one of the things I recall from those years, when you go into small cities in Quebec, similar to Center Wellington, so I'm talking about Drummondville or Trois-Rivières or Sherbrooke or other bigger towns and small cities, you can find, like picture a street in Fergus of single family homes, and you can find streets in small cities like Trois-Rivières where every single dwelling in a row for an entire street is a sixplex. And I also remember having colleagues and clients in Quebec in the 90s and 2000s. They were always struck by the cost of an apartment in Toronto versus that in Quebec City, in the cities of Quebec. And I think part of the solution has to be how do we incent small landlords to want to be landlords and owning a sixplex or 2 or 3 sixplexes, because that to me is part of the solution. One aspect of that, I recall in the, I believe in the 70s and 80s, when the world was crawling with young adult baby boomers, the government of Canada brought out something called a MURB. MURB is an acronym that stands for multi-unit residential building. And what they did, the government of Canada, was in order to incent small landlords, they allowed capital cost allowance, is just a fancy word for how fast you can depreciate a piece of business property or a rental property. They allowed, they created a special rule for these MURBs where you could depreciate the building really, really quickly. And the reason they did it is there was a crisis in housing then for young adults starting out in their 20s. There was a huge shortage of apartments, and I see a parallel to that today. And so I'm wondering if we can send a similar resolution to perhaps the government of Canada, asking them to help address housing by allowing small landlords to depreciate new rental properties on a more rapid basis. This, like we were in the exact same situation in the 70s and 80s, critical shortage of apartments, and the MURB was very effective. And if you drive along Speedvale Avenue in Guelph, you will see many, many MURBs. There are 4 and 6, 12 plexes along Speedvale and Stevenson, and also along Victoria Road. And as I say, when you drive around cities in Quebec, such as Drummondville, Sherbrooke, Trois-Rivières, or Laval, there's street after street after street of 6 and 8 and 12 plexes all in a row. I'm not suggesting
we're losing you. Here we go.
a way that we could address the problem by encouraging small landlords to build those kinds of sixplexes. We also know, if we look through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, in Toronto, they built many, many 20 and 30 and 40-story buildings. They didn't do that as much in Montreal. And we know, looking backward, that those kinds of buildings, there's places such as Jane and Finch or Regent Park in Toronto where those kinds of buildings, they have many, many social problems because that kind of housing is impersonal, I guess, for lack of a better word. And it's less desirable than small density and medium density, or as Brett said, gentle density. So there's some random thoughts on the problem. I'm wondering if we can send such a resolution to the government of Canada, encouraging them to bring back the MURB, because it will help small landlords go into the landlord business, building new buildings. And I'm wondering if there's a way we could transpose that at the local level to get more sixplexes.
Yeah, and I think historically, you look around, even in Ontario, back in the day, there were a lot of those buildings, and slowly but surely they got squeezed out because everybody wanted single family housing instead. But that is probably the kind of density in terms of built up areas that we want to encourage. And maybe there are, I think some of the recommendations, policy recommendations that we saw in the document would combine to do that. You've got to encourage people to build it, and then you've got to encourage, maybe it's the same people, maybe it's different people, you got to encourage landlords to actually manage it and be able to make enough money to incent them to do that. The trick to getting it built, I guess, is if you're going into a mature neighborhood already, surrounded by single family homes, what feedback, what blowback do you get by trying to put a sixplex right in the middle of it.
Lots.
3.
You get lots, Mr. Chair.
Exactly, you do. So you got to get it built even before it gets managed. And our role here could be find ways to make it easier for the people who want to build it. And that's one of the aspects of it, is dealing with that kind of response from the immediate neighbors and from the public at large. And offhand, I think that's probably what the development permit system maybe gets to, but we'll get into that. But definitely finding ways to incent people to do that is precisely where I think we want to go. Question is, how do we get there? In terms of and I just have a question for the mayor and maybe for the councilors on this group as well. In terms of sending resolutions from the committee, is that something that people say at the county want to hear? They're hearing from an advisory committee to a local council, or does it make more sense to get the local council to send that kind of resolution in support? So I guess do we have the standing, and would we be heard at a county council as a committee making our own resolution, whether it's to the county, to the province, to the feds, or is it still better to work that through the whole council in Center Wellington? And that's just a question I throw out there. I think the idea is a good one. What's the most impactful way to do it? So maybe Mayor Linton?
Yeah, no, it would have a lot of standing. Center Wellington is the largest community within the county. And I've talked about this group at a county level. The county knows about the things that we talk about here. This group was involved before in discussions when the county was moving ahead with some of the changes that they were identifying. So we're seen as kind of leading the way when it comes to having a group that includes citizen participation in an official committee. And so they very much take seriously a resolution that came from this committee, as opposed to a resolution that came from Township Council. That would be fine too, and we can do that as well. But if it comes right from this committee, recognizing that we have a mandate for healthy growth, that would mean something.
Okay.
And I'd never suggest, if it's resolutions, I'd never suggest a resolution if I didn't think that it would be something that was taken seriously, because I know a lot of resolutions, we see them all the time. And sometimes you just there's 444 municipalities, and when you see a resolution, yeah, great, it's a cut and paste job, but this is something that would be meaningful.
Anybody else on that? Councillor Foster?
Thank you, Chair. I'm wondering if such a resolution would have more weight. I believe there's some kind of a consortium of mayors and in the GTA. This is really a kind of a GTA problem, and we're more and more being drawn into the GTA orbit, as we all know. So I'm wondering if such a resolution would have a lot more weight through LUMCO, a large urban caucus of FCM, and of which I believe Mayor Cam Guthrie is the chair, or perhaps such a resolution coming from, I'm a little hazy, Mayor. I believe there's some kind of a consortium of GTA mayors, and a body like that making a resolution would have an amplifying effect, getting the Canada Revenue Agency to allow increased depreciation rates for small commercial landlords.
But
is that an avenue we could take, Mayor?
Yeah, just to be clear on what I was talking about as far as the resolution goes, this is a very specific resolution for support to the county's affordable housing, because I know what's coming up in the budget, and I know it's a new initiative. So it's very specific to what the county's doing. So that's why resolution right to the county about a specific program that's going to be included in a 10-year forecast. It's just something that states that this committee recognizes the need for affordable housing. Even though we don't play there, we're supportive of the county moving in a systematic way to include new builds for affordable housing over the next 10-20 years. So that's all. So it'd be very specific resolution that would be just in my mind to the county.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And to say that we're moving in parallel with that as well. And I think that Councillor Foster, the approach you recommend is probably best for if we were to decide there was anything that the federal government could do on a tax basis to encourage the construction of that kind of housing, then yeah, it's probably much more impactful coming from big city mayors than from, an advisory committee to the township of Center Wellington. But that's for a major income tax change over
That's
time.
right.
Yeah. So two different things. So the first thing is the mayor's resolution to the county, and if it's the view that would be well received, and certainly if it's the will of this committee, then there's no reason not to decide to do that immediately. So if that's the will of the committee, do we have sufficient? Poor Devlin, do you have any idea what we want to say? I know the mayor just sort of had a good phrase right there.
Well, first of all, Mr. Chair, I raise it as a discussion point because we know that folks like Stephen Wright don't really want to build multi-unit res. There for various reasons. It's not easy being a landlord and a small landlord, and we're seeing consolidation in the landlord business. Places like the Castellan boys have taken over a lot of the small apartments and small firms that were landlords, and so just don't want to build these things because single family is more profitable, and changing, allowing rapid depreciation of these buildings will help incent them to do it, and that's why I proposed it. I think small commercial landlords are part of our solution.
Yeah, I think makes perfect sense. Councillor McCray, did you have a comment? You're still muted. There we go.
Sorry, I had a little trouble unmuting. Thank you, Chairman Fisher. I just wanted to mention at our last meeting, Stephen Wright had mentioned that some of the new houses he was actually building second apartments inside the houses while he was doing it. And he said it was actually a cheaper route to go. So I'm wondering, the fact that we have so many houses being built, what if we were to encourage developers to automatically include as part of their house sale, building a house that includes an apartment? And then if we were able to arrange with the county could subsidize part of the cost of the homeowner renting that apartment. Because right now, homeowners that I'm aware of who are building these second apartments are looking at the market rates and going with $1,500 a month, whatever. And what we need to do is get that price down around, I think I saw sort of like $800 a month, $900 a month. Could we look at that somehow, an incentive to get developers to automatically include the apartment in the house they're building, and also to approach new home buyers to consider taking a sort of a cut in terms of getting something from the county to help pay for the rent. The other thing is we now started having whole communities where we have people who are being subsidized living amongst people who, have full incomes, rather than ghettoizing where we start building all these affordable housing buildings all in one area where really you want to have everyone interspersed amongst each other.
Okay. Anybody else? Don?
Yeah, I think, Ian, that's a really good idea. I think to start with, if it was a requirement to at least have the rough ends in a new house for washroom, kitchen, like put the plumbing in under the floor so that somebody could then move to that if they wanted to go there. That is a fairly reasonably inexpensive, when you're building a whole house, it's a reasonably inexpensive thing to do. But it would set the house up to make sure the access is right and all kinds of other, like all the rest of the regulations. It would really, it would set it up so that in the future, 5 years, 10 years, whenever, somebody could move to that. But the way it is right now, to go and put a bathroom in the basement and a kitchen in the basement, you get access issues, and try to set it up right off the bat. The other thing that happens is if somebody has a house and they want to get a mortgage and they have a rental unit, the rental unit doesn't count as income on a mortgage. So if you put a place in and you want to borrow money to do it, you got to borrow it yourself. They don't count the rental, and the banks don't count the rental income. Although it's there, they don't count it. So.
Okay. Andy?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a bit of a process piece. This committee is a committee of council, and so therefore any recommendations would need to go through council for approval or support to the county. So that's just a process piece. This committee is a committee of council.
So just to be clear, it's that in terms of the discussion we had about the resolution, or in terms
Correct.
of?
With regards to the resolution, Don, that we would have to make sure that that would go through to council, and then if council would approve, then that would be forwarded on to the county.
So that would be the form of council approving this committee to send a resolution directly,
Correct.
as opposed to supporting it or doing something on its own.
Yep.
Okay, well, either way, I think that's what we were getting at, but Kelly's point is if it seemed to be coming from the committee, it has weight. So however, the best way to get it there.
Correct.
Anybody else? Brett?
Just a comment about some of the things that have been talked about in the last round of discussion about accessory apartments and affordable rent. You know, one of the challenges we face with those things are there is no legal tool for us to control those things. So if somebody, if a builder builds an apartment, zoning, treats it's by use, not by whether it's owned or rent. So the township doesn't have the ability to say to somebody, you're going to build an apartment, it has to be a rental unit. We don't have that legal authority. We don't also have legal authority to dictate somebody's rent. So if the only way that we could say dictate this has to be a rental unit is if there's some other kind of process that we enter into where, perhaps we did give a grant or something that then would give us a tool to say, okay, in exchange for this grant, that has to be a rental building. But otherwise, we don't have any authority. Somebody comes in for a building permit to put in an apartment. If the zoning allows it, the chief building official's obligated to issue it. And we don't get to dictate whether it's rent or owned or how much it rents for. So we have to be very careful not to try to suggest things that we don't have legal authority to do. Or if we did, it would create a whole new bureaucracy to manage it.
Okay, anybody else? Brian?
Yes, in terms of practicality for this ongoing activity, would it be possible, would it be too much to ask the planning department to create a kind of a working list of ideas? And we know there are lots, from tiny homes to apartments above commercial properties to all of the things that have been mentioned in the document that the mayor presented to us. I think we almost need not a scorecard, but a kind of a document that spells out in simple terms, here is one thing you could do. And then we have the clamp put on it, or the proviso that, well, yes, we could do this, but there is this problem. I think we need a kind of a kit to get this thing to move forward. And I think we need to look at the things that are easiest and most applicable in the, immediately, and then the sort of the long-term things. So I understand, I realize I'm talking about creating work, but without a kind of overwhelming document or an overriding document that gives us a big picture, we're going to be flailing away at many different possibilities, and there are many. I think that we're on a good path here.
Just in response to that, I would suggest you've got a lot of that already in the document that we have. The policy suggestions at the end of it, all of them can be debated, and there are nuances that go with them. And there's probably a couple more things you could add to that list. But essentially, that's the list. We can start working at it. I don't know if the best way to look at it is, maybe I can look at the mayor or Brett for this. Do we want to, if we get to that point, go through each of those in detail, discuss how it might work and the ramifications, and what would need to be done to put it in place. That's one way to go, but we do have a list to start with. And then out of that discussion, Brian, there may well be additional things. I can think of a couple of things that could be added to that list right now that might come out of that. But rather than, putting somebody to work creating another list and another document, can we just start with the one that we have? Because there is a lot of meat there. There's more meat than meets the eye if we start talking in detail about each of those things. And I think the mayor's intent, with which I agree, is that we probably can't even deal with all of them realistically. We should, at the end of the day, as a result of our discussions, focus on 2 or 3 and move forward as quickly as possible. And the other thing, I don't want to overdo this, but we all have to remember that perfection is the enemy of the good. This is a list of things that we can do as a township, if they're adopted by council, to help remove the barriers to the provision of affordable housing or attainable housing. Whether they end up doing that or not, you'll never know unless you try. And the issue at this point is to get something that our council can reasonably pick and choose and decide to do, and then the municipality does it, and then you have to hope that somebody responds to that. And at the end of the day, 2 or 3 years from now, you start to see some improvement in the situation. So our role right now is, and I think others probably share this view, is to sort of move beyond just sort of a conceptual discussion of these items, get into the nitty gritty of these points, and come up with some concrete recommendations based on them. And then just finally, to Brett's point about enforcement, yes, there's no technical tools, but I think you hit on it at the end of the day, Brett, when you said, if we're handing out grants or development charge deductions or waivers, there are ways to influence subsequent behavior in the direction that we want to go. So we can get into that as part of a discussion on, for example, development charges. And that's why it would be very good to have our developer member here, because we need that input. But we need to create a package of incentives that make it at least feasible for these people to provide this kind of housing. And then we move forward from there, because if we get that done within the next couple of years, we're doing well. So to your point, Brian, I think a lot of that will come out as we discuss it. And I think we have a list to start with that we probably should start working on as soon as we can. But I think the first step we have today is to decide on sending a resolution to the county in support of their initiatives in this area. That's something you can do right away. And as Andy says, if we do that today, it goes to council endorses it or something, whatever that phraseology is, then off it goes to the county. Step 1. Step 2 is to start dealing with that list of suggestions and policies and get some that we can all settle on as something we want to do, and get them to council. And then council has to decide if that is in fact what they want to do. And that's, in my view, that's our contribution to this. So sorry about that. I didn't want to take up all the oxygen here. Anybody else have any comments at the moment? Mayor Linton.
Yeah, I think you're right on the right track, Don. So because all the conversations we've had so far, they'd come out if we went through the list, and then we drive towards some action. So the first thing that I think would be really valuable is to establish an attainable housing growth target, because what that would do would provide context for this group here and what we're driving towards. And so that could be kind of the lighthouse that we're working towards. So it would require a little bit of work on defining what attainable housing is, at least a working definition of what attainable housing is, and then establishing what's an attainable housing target for Center Wellington. And to me, then that is the criteria that we measure everything else against. How is this contributing to our goal when it comes to attainable housing? And so to me, if this committee can be okay with that, that's something we want to do, that's a huge first step, because it provides our foundation. So I'd like to see us be good with that, because in addition to a resolution of the county, I think those 2 items, if we can get okay on those 2 items, that sets us off really well. And then we kind of go through a list and identify where is our sphere here. Maybe, we take each line item. Well, maybe we can't play a role legally, but is there communication that we can provide? Is there something else we can provide to contribute to this? And then nail down what our sphere of influence is in each of those areas. At the end of the day, a yes or no from this committee. And then I think we're going to come up with 3 or 4 things. And I think that's what we need. Otherwise, we'll be conceptually talking about all these potentials, but not in a very rigorous way. And we're not going to drive to action. To me, I think that would drive us to real solid, doable recommendations. So that's my suggestion anyway, is that we first start with agreement that we want to establish an attainable housing growth target.
That would be a good first step. Do we know what a target would look like? Do we have any idea?
I think there's been work done in this, but I think there's a little bit of body of work to figure out what that is, what that lighthouse looks like, what that target looks like, but it can be done. I think other municipalities have done it, and I think it could be done. I don't know what the number would be. Obviously, maybe it's related to the vacancy rate at 3%. Maybe it's related to something like that, but I think if we can get a percentage or a number that we're driving towards, I think that's the way to do it. But we have to identify that this is something that we think would be valuable as a committee.
Okay, anybody? Don?
So Kelly, I'm sure other jurisdictions have looked at what those definitions are. Rather than us trying to reinvent the wheel, if we could adopt something. I don't know where you find that stuff. The other question I had actually was for Brett, is can the municipality mandate in a building permit process that somebody puts a rough in the basement or washroom and stuff? It can't. So could that be as an incentive on DC charges?
Well, with the latest DC, those things are already exempt now. So, I mean, hopefully that just took effect in September. So one of the things that's happened is you can add 2 units to a property and they would be exempt from development charges, whether it's a brand new unit or an existing unit.
Mhm.
Whereas in the past, that exemption on development charges was only there if you added an apartment to an existing unit.
Right.
So it discouraged a builder from putting the apartment in right away. We do know, for example, GenArc have been building 2-unit buildings all over Center Wellington for quite a while now. And they build it, it starts out as a permit for a single detached dwelling, but it's designed to know that the apartment's going to be added to it.
I think that's really the key, is to set something in place now that actually will flourish in time.
And the building code recognizes a different set of requirements when you're adding an apartment to an existing dwelling versus building it new too. So I think the thing that Steve Wright may have brought up at the last meeting was related to the building code requirements are more stringent if you try to build that second unit right away, as opposed to adding it afterwards.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Kathy?
I sit on Committee of Adjustment as well as a couple of other committees. So for probably the last couple of months, we've been having at least half of the applications that come forward are to do with secondary dwellings in houses. The problem that I sort of see with this is, as it becomes a right and nobody is, like, the planning department doesn't have to police it, or the building department, how do we protect the neighborhood from people who come in and try, like, I'm just thinking of one where we have like a 30-foot lot, and there is already, the house is bought for a rental in the top. They want to put a rental in the bottom, but the parking situation, the way the province has said, it allows a car to be in the garage and another car to be behind it, which sounds okay until you realize that the people in the basement have to get the people to move the car out of the garage, or if they're using the garage. Anyway, there's always going to be issues with moving cars around. So what my worry is that you're going to end up with a subdivision with cars parked on the front lawn, because potentially you could have 4 cars in every one of these buildings. There's no room to park a car between 2 driveways with 30 feet. So it sounds really good what we're talking about, but some of the issues that arise that are sort of everyday kind of problems that people will run into, we have to think about a little bit, because otherwise you're going to have a whole lot of streets that all you see are cars parked everywhere. And not to say that we can't do something to mitigate that, but we want to keep in mind that, like, people who come into the township that are not from the township, that are big developers, are going to try and make as much money as they can. I have no problem with that, but I think that we want to make sure that we're not impacting everyone else around the people who are doing this, as far as what the neighbors who buy the houses to be single family dwellings are going to have to experience.
Okay. Anybody else? So where do we want to go from here? We've talked about a number of things. Can we move on, at least get a recommendation to send the resolution to the county as step 1? The mayor has put to us as step 2 in this process to agree that one of the first things, or the first thing we should do, is to try and figure out some kind of target, attainable housing, affordable housing target. And then 3, as a matter of process, to start working through line by line the policy recommendations that are in the document that we have today. If that's an overall approach that we could take, you've got a number of meetings going forward to do that. And that gives us lots to talk about. So is that kind of where we're landing today, is to do those kinds of things and get it moving? Or is there anybody else have a different idea of how we move forward? Don.
I'll make that motion again to send the recommendation and acknowledgement to the county.
Okay, anybody second? Brian, get your name here, Brian. Good. All right. Are we all, any discussion? Do we need to talk about that any further? Or are we ready to call the question? Who wants to talk or call the question? I just see hands. Talk.
Oh, okay, do we have to send it to council first as the process?
I think that's what Andy said.
I'd be happy to second that.
I think Brian already did.
Yes, Don, correct. We have to go to council for their approval first.
So we're asking their permission to forward a separate resolution to the county, or are we asking the township to endorse the resolution that we plan to send? Just to be clear.
Permission.
Permission to send it?
Correct.
Okay. So that's part of the wording then, is that we're requesting permission from our council to send a separate resolution to county council with respect to their attainable housing initiatives process, whatever that is. So that's the resolution we're going to be voting on? Councilor Foster?
I would think that this committee would make a recommendation to council, and then council in turn would, that be done, and then council would actually do it procedurally, I think. Is that not correct?
Well, it could be.
Andy?
I think the mayor was talking about two. You could do two, like council could send its own. Council could say it's enough that it comes from healthy growth, or council could say, we don't want anybody sending a resolution. I guess those are their options. But we're going to send, we as a committee are going to suggest that we send one on our own. Council can either agree or disagree. And then secondarily, council could say, no, we'll send it instead, or council can say, we'll then send it as well. I guess those are the options as I understand it. So, Andy?
Yeah, I think what we're looking for is council to endorse this committee's resolution to coming from this committee to the county. So we would have to provide that information to council of what this committee is asking or what they're wanting to send to the county.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we're getting permission to send it ourselves, as opposed to a resolution coming from council. Okay. Are we good with that, everybody? Call the question. Are we all in favor of that? I think that's everybody. All right, so we'll try and wordsmith something. Maybe run it by Brett and the mayor and myself and Andy, and then we can send it on. Is that acceptable? Don? You're still muted. There we go.
Okay. Just a thought on top of what we're doing right now. Is it something that we can ask the county if they're doing some of this housing in Center Wellington, that we are involved with the planning stages of it? Just so we get, up the front where they're going. If they're doing stuff somewhere else in the county, I mean, it's not our place, but can we ask them for a seat at the table if they are planning any more here?
Yeah, the county won't move ahead on anything in any municipality without the approval and speaking to all the municipality who's involved. They take very seriously the town's position on everything related to development. So
Okay.
they're not going to slide anything through while I'm there anyway.
Yeah, no, it's just, just to make sure there's a connection between the two.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know how, I mean, yes, they consult. I'm not sure they would want anybody, another level of scrutiny. On the other hand, if we're informed of their initiatives early on, we can modify or bake that into our discussions.
Yep.
About things we might be doing. I guess it's just a timing issue then.
Yep.
Okay.
That's fine. It was just something I thought of that, just to make sure we're all on the same path. That's the whole thing.
All right. So Brett.
Just wanted to say for the next meeting too, on the second point, staff can put together some thoughts or a paper on what the attainable housing sort of research says. And then we'll go through those recommendations that are in the county attainable housing strategy and just add some commentary on them and, as to how difficult they might be to do, what other resources we might require. That way we can filter them out. And we can spend the next little while doing that, and then we'll have something focused. As I said, the easiest one is the additional dwelling units.
All right. I think that is the way to go. And it kind of gets to Brian's original point about coming up with some additional documentation that we could start the discussion with. We don't want it to be too much work for you, but it certainly kicks it off. Just some of the issues. The only one I would add, I didn't see on the list, but I think we've talked about it, is something about township regulation of short-term rentals, Airbnb type things. So if that's something you'd want to take, I would add that to the list and start to consider that as well. But anything that gets us going in a specific way would be good. Certainly an idea of what a target would look like, or whether they're monetary targets in terms of target rent, whether they're construction targets of units at a certain value. I mean, housing at a certain value, I suppose, translates down to monthly affordability when you work it all through. So however we can structure those targets, and of course, there's the vacancy rate target, that just gives us something to work towards, then I think that's a very valid point. And then start in on the discussion of those policy options, because there's a lot there. So is that the way we want to go forward? I appreciate the suggestion that you're willing to start it that way. Everybody good with that? All right. Do we have anything else to talk about today? All right. Thank you. I would suggest then, if we have nothing to talk about, we're adjourned. Wow.
Thanks,
Okay.
Don. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Don.
Good rest of
Merry
your day.
Christmas, everyone as
Thanks,
well.
everyone.
Yeah, that's right.
Merry Christmas,
to
everybody.
Yeah.
Yes, Merry Christmas.
Hopefully a
The next
better year in
meeting-
2021.
Yeah,
Well,
let's,
Next meeting
let's
is
hope we
when?
get out of this mess we're in.
Well, hopefully we can get together personally sooner rather than later. Sure would make this a lot.
That would be a lot better.
Brian,
Oh,
you got a
great.
question?
I was
Great
just
Britain were the
asking when
first
the
to
next
approve a
meeting is.
vaccine, so
Yeah. Well, UK did
we're on
it.
the road, we're rolling.
Go to London, you'll get it today. London, England.
Next meeting, Brian, next meeting is January 6th.
January 6th. Okay.
You'll still be hungover from New Year's. Okay, guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Don.
Care, everybody.
you.
Merry Christmas.
Yeah, see you.